The family group chat was called Reyes Fam Red Heart, and Elena had muted it 11 months ago, back when Camille first started posting the theory. She's not married. Have you ever seen a wedding photo? A real one? No house tour. No husband's LinkedIn. Nothing. I think she's lonely and embarrassed and made up a whole life because she can't admit she failed. Elena read every message from her office on the 19th floor of a building she partially owned, 3 miles from the 2-bedroom apartment in Rainier Valley, where she'd grown up sharing a wall with Camille. She read them the night her company, Halcyon Logistics, cold chain distribution for biologics, the unglamorous plumbing that kept insulin and vaccines alive between factory and patient, closed a Series D that valued it at $180 million. She read them again the morning her son Theo lost his first tooth and her husband Daniel held the boy upside down by the ankles as a joke while Maya, 4, shrieked with laughter in the kitchen, syrup dripping off a fork onto the tile. She did not respond. She had stopped trying to be believed 4 years ago. Around the same time, she stopped trying to be forgiven for marrying Daniel at 22, in a courthouse, against every instruction her parents had given her. The instructions had been specific. Marry someone from the parish. Marry someone whose mother her mother already knew. Marry someone who wouldn't take her 3 states away for a surgical residency at a hospital that didn't return phone calls from worried Filipino mothers asking if their daughter was being fed. Daniel had failed every one of those instructions simply by existing as himself, a quiet, overworked white kid from Ohio whose own father had told him at his med school white coat ceremony that surgery was a real doctor's job and that Daniel, going into trauma, was playing at it. 2 people who'd each spent their childhoods being told they weren't quite the right shape for what they wanted had found each other in a hospital cafeteria over bad coffee, and neither of their families had ever fully forgiven them for choosing each other over the futures that had been planned. You could just send them a photo, Daniel said one night, folding laundry with a particular focus of a man who treated laundry like a controlled task with a clear beginning and end, the same way he approached Tria. 1 photo. Us, the kids, the house. Done. It wouldn't be done, Elena said, not looking up from her laptop, where a shipping manifest for a Tacoma warehouse blinked red. It would just be the next thing they didn't believe. She didn't tell him the rest, that some nights she still lay awake rehearsing the version of herself that would finally be enough for her mother, and that no amount of money had ever touched that particular ache. The house, the husband, the company. All real, all built by hand, and still, in the one room that mattered most, she was a rumor. 2. The hire. Camille hired the private investigator in March, on a Tuesday, in the parking lot of the pharmacy where she picked up their mother's medications, sitting in her car for 40 minutes after the transaction because she didn't trust her hands to be steady enough to drive. His name was Marcus Doyle, 51, ex-Seattle PD, the kind of man who wore the same brown corduroy jacket to every meeting because it had pockets he trusted more than most people. Camille paid him $1,100 up front, money she'd built $5 and $10 at a time over 6 years, tucked into an envelope in her sock drawer, money she told herself was for an emergency, without ever specifying what kind. She'd earned that money the hard way. For 6 years, she had been the one taking their father, Walter, to 2 separate hip surgeries, the one driving their mother, Diane, to appointments where a neurologist used words like mild cognitive impairment and then, 18 months later, words like early stage. Each visit a small, private grief Camille absorbed alone in waiting rooms while her own marriage quietly starved from neglect back home. Her husband, Ray, growing distant in the exact proportion that she grew consumed. She had done all of this while working 32 hours a week at a dental office answering phones, because full-time work would have meant no flexibility for the appointments, and no flexibility would have meant her parents managing alone. She did not know that Elena had contributed money to quiet wire transfers under a name Camille never questioned, because questioning it would have complicated the story she needed to be true. Camille needed, badly, for her sister's life to be a lie. If Elena's life was real, husband, kids, company, house, then Camille's own life, the one spent in the apartment with the thin walls, the one spent watching her own knees start to ache at 39, the one spent absorbing the entire weight of aging parents while her sister built empires in another zip code, was simply the life of someone who'd stayed while her sister ran. If Elena's life was a lie, then staying had been the smarter choice all along, the only choice, the noble choice. Camille needed the lie the way a person needs a diagnosis. Not because it's good news, but because at least it explains the pain, gives it a shape, gives it a villain who isn't just circumstance. Doyle took the case and did his job the way he did every job, methodically, without opinions about the client's motives. He found the marriage certificate in 6 days, Daniel Whitfield and Elena Reyes, filed in King County 9 years prior. No fanfare. A courthouse wedding with 2 witnesses pulled off the sidewalk outside, a paralegal and a UPS driver who happened to be on their lunch break. He found the 2 children's birth records, Theodore Reyes Whitfield, age 7, and Maya Reyes Whitfield, age 4. He found Halcyon Logistics Incorporation papers, filed the same year as the wedding, then its Series A 2 years later, then its Series B, then its Series C, then the trade publication that had run a profile on Elena 18 months back under the headline "The Quiet Founder Nobody's Heard Of," a headline that existed specifically because Elena had refused every request for a personal profile, every photo shoot with her family in frame, every attempt from a journalist to turn her private life into content for public consumption. That would have been enough for the 41-page report Doyle originally intended to write, a tidy stack of proof that would humiliate Camille without meaning to. But on a Tuesday in April, cross-referencing property records out of pure professional habit rather than instruction, Doyle always checked property. It was where people hid things they didn't know they were hiding. He found the second thing. 9 years earlier, 6 months after her wedding and 4 months before her parents stopped speaking to her over it, a shell entity called Meridian Northside LLC had purchased the modest rental duplex on Alder Street. The same duplex Walter and Diane Reyes had rented for 18 years. The same duplex Camille had moved back into after her divorce, sleeping in her childhood bedroom at 36. The same duplex where their mother now spent her mornings not always remembering which decade it was, sitting at the kitchen table Diane had bought secondhand in 1998 and refused to replace. Meridian Northside LLC's sole managing member, buried 3 layers down in estate filing Doyle had to pay to unseal, was Elena Reyes Whitfield. The rent had never gone up. Not once in 9 years. In a neighborhood where comparable units had tripled in that same window, where 2 similar duplexes on the same block had been flipped and resold to young tech workers commuting to South Lake Union. 2 maintenance emergencies, a collapsed water heater the winter Diane's memory first started to slip, a roof leak during Walter's first hospitalization, had been quietly covered by the landlord's insurance, per the property management company Elena had hired specifically to handle every interaction, so her name never surfaced. When Walter's hours got cut during the pandemic, 3 months of rent simply never got collected, logged in Meridian's internal books as a hardship deferral, a term Elena had chosen because it sounded like policy and not like what it actually was. Her lying awake at 2 in the morning, calculating exactly what her family could survive and quietly making sure they never had to find out. Doyle sat with a second envelope for 4 days before he called Camille. He'd delivered bad news to a lot of clients over 20 years, cheating spouses, embezzling business partners, adopted children who didn't want to be found. He had never once delivered news that inverted the entire moral architecture of a client's own family story, and he wanted to get it right. 3. The call. "Ma'am," he said when he finally called, "I found the husband, and the children, and the estate. Everything you described as fictional is documented, verified, filed with 3 separate government agencies. Your sister was telling the truth." There was a long silence on the line, the particular silence of a person recalibrating everything at once. "That's fine," Camille said finally, voice tight, one hand pressed flat against her sternum as if she could hold something in place there.
"Fine.
Send the report. That's what I paid for. There's something else you need to see." "What?" Doyle chose his words the way he'd learned to over 2 decades of delivering news that rearranged people's lives without warning. "Your family's been living in a property she's owned for 9 years." Camille didn't speak for 11 seconds. Doyle counted, out of professional habit, the way he counted everything, heartbeats, silences, the exact number of steps between a car and a front door. "Say that again," Camille said. He did. "She's our landlord." She's been your landlord since before your father's first hip surgery. She's covered your emergency repairs. She never raised your rent once, in a market where rent in that neighborhood has gone up over 200%. There's a deferral on record for the months your father was between jobs. I don't have direct evidence of intent beyond the documents, but the pattern is, it's consistent with someone managing the situation from a distance on purpose, without wanting to be identified. Camille sat on the edge of her bed in the apartment she'd once resented for its thinness and now understood differently, and she cried in a way she hadn't allowed herself to since her divorce. Not primarily for being wrong about her sister, though that was tangled in it, but for the 9 years she'd spent believing she was the only one holding the family together, the only one paying any real cost, when in fact she'd had a silent partner the entire time, one she'd spent that same period accusing of abandonment in a group chat under a crying face emoji from their father. 4. What Elena never told anyone. Elena had bought the duplex in a single week of grief and fury 9 years earlier, right after her parents stopped speaking to her over the wedding. She had not told Daniel the full reasoning at the time, only that she needed to handle something, and he, 3 months into a brutal trauma fellowship, running on 4 hours of sleep and hospital coffee, had trusted her the way he'd trust a colleague to close an incision correctly, without needing to watch every stitch. The reasoning was this. Her mother had spent 31 years afraid of one thing above all others, losing housing. Diane had grown up in Cebu in a household that lost its home twice, once to a typhoon and once to a landlord's decision, and she had carried that fear across an ocean and past it, without meaning to, into every conversation about money she'd ever had with her daughters. You don't own the roof over your head. You don't own anything. Elena had heard that sentence 100 times growing up, usually followed by her mother checking, compulsively, that the rent envelope was ready 3 days before it was due. Elena could not fix her mother's fear. She could not fix 9 years of silence, of birthdays acknowledged with nothing, of a wedding her parents didn't attend, of grandchildren they had met exactly 4 times in 7 years, always at neutral, tense gatherings arranged by Camille as go-between. But she could make sure that whatever happened between her and them, whatever they believed or didn't believe about her life, her mother would never again lie awake afraid of a landlord's decision. So she had bought the building through a shell entity, quietly, and instructed the property manager that no rent increase would ever be applied to that unit and that any request for repair should be handled immediately, without needing sign-off, without her parents ever learning who owned the walls around them. She told no one. Being found out had never been the point. The point had been that some love didn't require permission or belief to keep functioning. Life outside the war. The group chat war was not the center of Elena's life, though it sat in the background of it the way a headache sits behind other, more ordinary activities. The center of her life, that spring, was a refrigeration failure at a Tacoma distribution hub that put $400,000 of temperature-sensitive vaccine shipment at risk, and Elena spent 11 hours standing in a warehouse in a blazer and a pair of steel-toed boots borrowed from a foreman named Hector, personally overseeing the emergency transfer because her operations director, Priya, was on paternity leave, and Elena did not trust anyone else to make the call under that kind of pressure. She had built Halcyon on exactly this instinct, that the boring, invisible infrastructure between a lab and a patient's arm was where lives actually got saved or lost, and that nobody would ever thank her for it, and that this was fine because she hadn't built it to be thanked. The center of her life was also Theo, 7, who had recently developed an obsession with tide pools after a school field trip to Alki Beach, and who narrated dinner most nights with detailed, unsolicited facts about sea stars regenerating lost arms, a fact Elena found herself thinking about more than she wanted to admit. It was Maya, 4, who had just started preschool and cried every morning at drop-off for exactly 90 seconds before switching, instantly, to Delight, a transition so fast it made the preschool teachers laugh every single day. It was Daniel's growing exhaustion as chief resident, the particular hollowed-out quality he carried home some nights after losing a patient he'd fought for on the table for 3 hours, nights when Elena would simply sit with him without asking him to talk, because she'd learned that some kinds of pain needed company more than conversation. It was also, quietly, her best friend Renata, a college roommate turned corporate lawyer who was the only person outside Elena's immediate household who knew the full truth about the duplex because Renata had drafted the LLC paperwork 9 years ago as a favor, no fee, over a bottle of wine in a studio apartment neither of them could really afford at the time. Renata was the one who periodically asked gently, "Are you ever going to tell them?" And Elena was the one who always said, "Tell them what? That I love them? I don't need credit for that." 6. The news travels sideways. Elena found out the way she found out most things about her family, secondhand, 3 days late, from her cousin Rosa, who wasn't in the group chat war and therefore existed as a kind of neutral wire service between the two camps. "Camille knows," Rosa said, over the phone, while Elena stood in the parking lot of the Tacoma warehouse, breath fogging in the cold storage air even though it was April, about the house. "She's not doing great, Elena." Elena felt something in her chest that had nothing to do with vaccines and everything to do with a decade of carefully guarded silence suddenly rupturing without her permission. How does she know? The investigator. He told her everything. The husband, the kids, the company, and the duplex. Elena closed her eyes. Somewhere behind her, a forklift beeped in reverse. "Okay," she said, mostly to herself. "Okay." That night she told Daniel while he was reading Maya's favorite book for the 4th consecutive time, a battered picture book about a lighthouse keeper, and Theo was building a fort out of couch cushions in the next room, narrating tide pool facts to an audience of stuffed animals, the ordinary chaos of a life Elena had built specifically to be unshakable. "They know about the house," she said. Daniel put the book down. He knew what the house meant to her. He'd watched her set it up in secret the year after his own father had told him, at his white coat ceremony, that a residence salary wasn't a real profession, that Daniel would never amount to his older brother's cardiology practice, a comment that had quietly bonded Elena and Daniel from nearly the beginning. Two people building lives their families had already written off. "How do you feel?" he asked, and it wasn't a therapist's question, it was a genuine one. The kind he asked because he'd learned over 9 years that Elena's face and Elena's feelings often disagreed with each other. "Exposed," she said. "Which is stupid, because it was a kind thing. I don't know why doing something kind and being seen doing it feels worse than being called a liar." "Because being a liar was a story you could ignore," Daniel said, pulling her against him on the couch, Maya's forgotten book still open on the cushion beside them. "This is a story you have to be in." 7. The direct call. Camille called her 2 weeks later. Not through the group chat. Directly, on a Sunday afternoon, while Elena was in the backyard watching Theo attempt, with great seriousness, to build a tide pool habitat in an old plastic tub. "I don't know how to start this conversation," Camille said. "You don't have to," Elena said, moving toward the porch so Theo wouldn't hear. "You can just tell me what you need. I need to know why you never told me." Elena looked out at her small backyard, at the fence Daniel had built 2 summers ago on a rare stretch of days off, and found that the honest answer was smaller and stranger than she expected. "Because if I told you, you'd have had to decide how to feel about needing help from someone you'd already decided was a liar. I didn't want you to have to do that math. I just wanted Mom to have a roof. You could have let me hate you less. I didn't do it so you'd hate me less. Do you know what it's been like?" Camille's voice cracked, and something in it, not accusation now, but exhaustion, real exhaustion, 9 years of it, landed differently than anything she'd ever said in the group chat. "Watching them get older. Doing every appointment alone. Believing my whole life that I was the one who stayed and you were the one who ran off and built something shiny while I did the actual work of keeping this family alive. And this whole time you were, what, doing it invisibly? So, I'd never even get to be grateful. I didn't need your gratitude. Maybe I needed to give it," Camille said, and that landed on Elena harder than she expected, because it was true. She had, without quite meaning to, taken away not just her family's ability to doubt her, but Camille's ability to ever fully thank her, and there was a kind of arrogance buried inside that generosity that Elena hadn't examined until this exact moment. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was the silence of 2 sisters recognizing at the same time that 9 years of resentment had been built on an incomplete picture, and that an incomplete picture doesn't become complete just because it's corrected. It just becomes a different, more complicated, kind of painful. 8. The parents. They didn't fix everything in that call. Camille didn't apologize for the group chat, not fully. She offered a version of an apology tangled up with her own decade of exhaustion, something closer to "I understand now that I'm sorry," and Elena, who had wanted a real apology for years, found that receiving half of one from someone visibly breaking under her own weight didn't feel like victory. It felt like grief with company. Their parents never did apologize, not really. Walter sent a text 3 weeks later. "Thank you for the house." 5 words that acknowledged 9 years of quiet cost with no reference to 9 years of accusation, no mention of the crying emoji, no mention of the months of silence. Elena stared at those 5 words for a long time before typing back, simply, of course, Dad. Diane, in the fog that had claimed most of her recent memories, asked Camille twice who had bought the house, and twice forgot the answer within the hour, which meant that the one person Elena had built the whole arrangement to protect would likely never fully know it had happened at all. A fact that Elena found, when she let herself sit with it, was its own particular kind of loss. She had spent 9 years protecting a woman who would never get to understand she'd been protected, and there was no fixing that now. No amount of money or apology that could return her mother's memory or the years already lost to silence. 9. What Elena kept. Elena kept the report Doyle wrote. All 47 pages, the marriage certificate and the birth records and the Series D filing and the LLC paperwork, in a drawer in her home office instead of a bonfire, because some part of her understood it was the only document that had ever definitively proven her family wrong, and she didn't need to burn it to be free of needing it. Some nights, doing paperwork late, she'd see the edge of the folder and feel nothing in particular, not vindication, not anger, just the flat fact of it, evidence of a life that had never needed proving in the first place, proved anyway. She gave Doyle a bonus, unprompted, wired directly to his business account with a note. "Thank you for doing this carefully." He wrote back a single line. "Ma'am, in 20 years, that's the first time a family case ended with someone thanking the guy hired to expose them." The play. At Theo's school play that spring, a modest, chaotic production in which he played a tree with one line about roots, Camille showed up uninvited but not unwelcome, and sat 2 seats down from Daniel, close enough to be counted as family, far enough to signal she knew she hadn't fully earned the closer seat yet. She cried during Theo's line, badly, the way people cry when the actual thing they're crying about has nothing to do with a 7-year-old in a cardboard tree costume. Afterward, in the school parking lot, Maya ran directly at Camille's legs and hugged them without preamble, the way 4-year-olds do, unburdened by 9 years of anything, and Camille knelt down and held her for longer than the hug required, and over the top of Maya's head she looked at Elena and neither of them said anything, because nothing needed to be said in that particular moment, only carried. Nobody in that parking lot spoke about the house. Nobody needed to. It sat between them the way old debts sit between people who've decided to keep living near each other anyway. Not resolved, not forgotten, just carried, the way Elena had always carried the ache of not being believed even after the believing finally, incompletely, arrived. She had gotten her sister back, partially. She had gotten an acknowledgement from her father, small and late. She would never get her mother's understanding, not really, not in the way she'd once hoped for. Something had been repaired. Something else. 9 years of a mother's awareness. 9 years of a childhood memory neither Camille's kids nor Elena's kids would ever get to share as cousins who'd grown up close, was simply gone, and no 47-page report, however thorough, could bring it back.